Great to see so many faces so early in the morning. And I should say that it's really early for me since I'm on the West Coast. But I'm really glad to be here, and hopefully I can give you all something that you can take away with you that will be very helpful today. So the first thing I want to know, Chevy, is did I cut into some of my time? Do I need to readjust how much time I take to talk? I don't know. I'm not hearing anything. So I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Just go ahead there.
Are you?
Just go ahead.
You can hear me. Okay. So I want to start first of all by giving a very quick disclaimer, which is that while I'm an attorney, nothing I say here today should be construed as legal advice. So if you have a situation going on at work where you feel like you need to talk to an attorney, please do so outside of here. Of course, I work for an organization called the Lawfare Project, and in our organization, we have attorneys that can talk to you if something is going on. You can always give us a call. We don't charge to analyze what's going on with you, and occasionally, if your case falls within our mission statement, we'll actually take on your case. So that's a good thing to know. What I wanted to do today is I want to talk about the federal anti-discrimination law that exists to protect you against religious discrimination in the workplace. I also wanted to tell you what exactly that law is and how you can apply that at every stage of the employment process, starting from the interview and moving all the way to the end if God forbid something goes wrong and you need to start getting involved in the legal process to rectify your situation. So first of all, I want to say that in 1964, Congress passed sweeping anti-discrimination laws that stopped all forms of discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex, and most importantly, religion, which is what we're here to talk about today. And that reform is to stop religion in every aspect of life. The part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that deals with discrimination in the workplace is called Title VII. So you can just say Title VII, everybody knows what you're talking about. Don't have to say it's the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII. And I would like to, like I said, tell you what Title VII is, what your employer's obligations are according to Title VII, and then how you can use that throughout the whole entire employment process. So first of all, Title VII provides two kind of major obligations on the part of your employer. The first obligation your employer has is to maintain a work environment free from religious harassment and intimidation. The second part of Title VII that your employer incurs an obligation through is the obligation to reasonably accommodate. An employer has an obligation to reasonably accommodate its employees' religious observances, practices, and beliefs unless the employer can demonstrate that doing so, in other words, being new, will cause undue hardship to the employer's business. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about both. I think most of you are probably most interested in the reasonable accommodation aspect because of Shabbos and all the holidays. But I don't want to gloss over the discrimination aspect of it because I think it's important. So what does it mean when it says that your employer has to provide a workplace free from discrimination and harassment, right? First of all, the first thing you have to know is that the harassment and discrimination has to be coming as a result of the fact that you're religious. So if you have a nasty coworker who's always making nasty comments about your hair or is just rude to you, and even if they're doing it on a regular basis and they're really affecting you, you can't go to your employer and say, hey, you have an obligation under Title VII to give me a workplace free from harassment, so you need to do something about it. Because that is not, Title VII specifically applies to protected classes, one of which is religious people, right? So the discrimination has to come as a result of you being religious. So let's say somebody is being harassing to you at work, either your employer or a coworker, and it's about the fact that you're Jewish, so it's specifically covered under Title VII. The question is, how bad does discrimination have to get in order for your boss And this is something that's widely litigated. You know, people say, I've been discriminated against, I've been harassed because I'm Jewish, and my employer did nothing. They go to court and they fight over, did that harassment or discrimination rise to the level that your employer was obligated to step in and do something pursuant to Title VII, this law, right? Now, the general rule I tell people who ask me, and my clients that come in, is that the discrimination or harassment has to be pervasive and it has to affect your ability to do your job. So, and it has to not necessarily just affect your ability to do the job, but it would affect any reasonable person's ability to do the job. And I say that because if you're very, very, very sensitive and somebody makes one comment and that's it, you're done for the whole week, you can't work, they're not gonna see that as a pervasive discrimination that most people can't tolerate, right? So, or pervasive harassment. So it has to rise to the level of most people will think this kind of harassment is extremely pervasive and they don't have the ability or they feel it very difficult to continue to work. So an example would be, like, let's say you come to work and, your coworker says something like, I'm going to this place for lunch, but not inviting you because you're Jewish and cheap, right? And that's not nice. And, maybe next week she makes a similar comment. Is that pervasive enough? No, it's not. However, on the other hand, if your coworker makes that comment, then she tells everybody about it. Then every time everybody walks by your desk, they're saying cheap, 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 or something nasty, and they're sending you jokes about cheap Jewish people, and they're not inviting you every single day to lunch, so you're excluded, and no one talks to you. I mean, that becomes very pervasive. And yes, then you can approach your employer and say, listen, this is what's going on, and I would like you to do something about it. The important thing about the discrimination aspect, probably the most important thing, is for people to be able to identify what is anti-Semitism. In other words, what is discrimination based on the fact that you're Jewish and religious. And this can be, believe it or not, really difficult because a lot of people see anti-Semitism everywhere they go. And they're wearing basically anti-Semitism colored glasses. And the problem with that is that, you see anti-Semitism everywhere, you end up being the boy who cried wolf. And then when there's really an issue, nobody pays attention to you. Or what happens is you're crying wolf and then nobody pays attention to any of the other Jewish people who have really serious situations going on because of what you're doing. And it's not necessarily people's fault for being this way, but it's something that you have to be careful about. The earliest recollection I have of somebody being that way, I'm thinking about my grandmother. I remember when I was about 10 years old going to the bank with my grandmother, and those days the bank closed at 3 p.m. And I remember we were rushing to get to the bank, and of course we show up at like 3:02 p.m. and the bank of course is closed. So my grandmother is, knocking on the window, waving her deposit slip, hoping to get the guy to open the door, motioning that all she wants to do is make a deposit. The guy looks up and he's like, we're closed, right? I remember my grandmother looking at me and saying, that anti-Semite. And I remember thinking, well, why is he anti-Semitic? I remember saying that to my grandmother. And it was the first lesson I had in people wearing anti-Semitism glasses. And it's very important that you don't make the mistake. So if there's a situation at work and you think it's anti-Semitic, talk to somebody reasonable that can listen to what's going on and kind of give you an objective opinion about what they think. And when I say talk to somebody reasonable, do not talk to your mom or dad because everything going on with you is anti-Semitic. You want to talk to, maybe your rabbi, maybe, a friend. Maybe you can even go to your counsel what's going on and eventually, figure out whether this is something that you need to bring to anybody's attention. So, having said that, that's about discrimination. One last thing I want to say is that your boss is not allowed to discriminate, your employer cannot discriminate against you in any area whatsoever. In other words, when it comes to employment, not just in hiring or firing, but absolutely any area. Not in promoting, when it comes to promoting. promoting practices, recruiting practices, disciplinary practices, transferring practices, whatever area of employment exists, they're not allowed to discriminate in, including creating a disparate impact on you because of your religion. What does that mean? That means that there could be a totally facially neutral rule, meaning on the face it seems like a neutral rule that they've made, but it disparately or disproportionately impacts you because you're Jewish. What would be an example of that? Let's say the hospital puts a policy in and says, whoever wants to get, promoted or choose their shifts or something good, they can do that so long as they show up to ice cream socials, right? Problem is, ice cream socials only happen Friday night. If they only happen Friday night, guess what? You can never go to an ice cream social. That disproportionately impacts you because you're Jewish, right? So you can raise that to your employer and say, hey, Jewish people can never go to ice cream socials. Can we please change the policy? All right, the next thing I want to talk about is the other half of Title VII, which is the part I think most of you are interested in, and that is your boss or your employer's obligation to reasonably accommodate you. Now, this is really important that you focus on the words of what it says. This is not like sexual harassment, for example. There is zero tolerance for sexual harassment. Your boss, nobody at the workplace can ever sexually harass you. One incident is enough to cause a problem for your employer. That is not the case for your boss's obligation to reasonably accommodate you, because there are two issues that they always look at. Number one, what is reasonable accommodation? And if a reasonable accommodation is not available, your boss does not have to accommodate you, okay? Number two, will the reasonable accommodation cause undue hardship to your employer? If it does, again, your employer doesn't have to provide you with the reasonable accommodation. So let's just talk a little bit about what reasonable accommodation is and what undue hardship is, and then what I'd like to do is go through from the beginning to the end from your interview process all the way to, like I said, if God forbid something goes wrong, and how you apply all of what I'm talking about. So, first of all, reasonable accommodation includes things like, you say you can't work on Shabbos, they say, well, why can't you? And you're like, well, I can't turn on electricity, I can't write, all the things you can't do. They can say, well, you're in your training, we want you to come during your training, you don't have to do any of that. All you need to do is show up and, follow your preceptor route, or whatever it is that, you have to do at the time. That would be a reasonable accommodation. Another reasonable accommodation is to give you a substitute shift. Oh, you can't work on Saturday, no problem, you'll work on Sundays, right? What is not a reasonable accommodation? Not a reasonable accommodation is you say, listen, I don't want to tell anybody anything. As soon as a Friday, night, my shop, I just leave. I don't have to tell anybody. I just have permission to just walk out anytime there's a Jewish holiday and I can't work. Clearly, that's not fair for your employer. Your employer needs to know that you're not going to be there. That would not be a reasonable accommodation. Another reasonable accommodation that people always don't think about is your employer is not responsible or is not obligated to say, okay, you can't work on Shabbos, therefore, the only other person that would be available is a very senior person who has gotten to the point where he's allowed to choose all of his shifts. Now, he no longer has that privilege because you can't work on Shabbos, he has to work on Shabbos, no more choosing shifts. The courts have found that that is an undue hardship on the employer, and the employer does not have to let you do that. So, but you have the Shabbos off, right, for that. Also, it's not reasonable, for example, to expect an employer who only has 2 nurses in his office to say you just don't have to come in every Shabbos if he doesn't have another nurse to take your place, right? So, in other words, reasonable accommodation, and of course it's endless, and it can go into many different, like what's reasonable, what's not, and there's all kinds of standards and formulas that courts use when somebody brings this issue in court. And so I'm never going to go into all of it, but if push comes to shove and you're stuck in a situation where you believe your employer could reasonably accommodate you, yet your employer is refusing to accommodate then that is a time to go ahead and talk to somebody that's in the legal area. Talk to a lawyer, find out, tell them what's going on, find out before things escalate what you can do to help yourself, because there are things to do to help yourself. But now, for the I guess the most important part of all this is I want us to talk about how you can implement all these things. So, okay, the first thing to know is when you show up for an interview, do you have to, people always ask me, do I have to talk about whether or not I'm Orthodox and need Jewish accommodations? Because if you have a number of offers on the table where you know they're going to reasonably accommodate you, you want to see their reaction at this new place, because you already have a job set up. You want to make sure that this place will also reasonably accommodate you without, not begrudgingly. And you can usually sense that at the interview. So you may want to say, I need this accommodation, just to get their reaction and know whether or not this is the right job for you. On the other hand, if you don't have a job, and this is the only job, you may not want to say anything, get yourself the job, and then talk about reasonable accommodations once you were offered the position. So let's talk about the fact that you got hired, right? You're in the position, you need these reasonable accommodations. What do? Well, the first thing you do, if you're part of a union, is you find out who your union rep is, the delegate is, and just introduce yourself. Have a nice conversation, talk about, just hi, I just want to know who I talk to, is there any issues, just to kind of set up a relationship. Next thing you want to do is find out about all the different policies about how to get reasonably accommodated in the hospital. Sometimes it's in their policies, sometimes you have to ask somebody because it's not clearly written. But what is extremely important is that when you ask for your reasonable accommodation, you do so without the entitlement disposition. I cannot begin to tell you how many clients of mine come in, and I see where things are going south. They start going south when they come in with an entitled attitude. So when you come in to the office, talk to whoever it is that you need to talk to about reasonable accommodation. Don't come in saying, I'm here because pursuant to Title VII, which is a federal law, anti-discrimination law that you are obligated by, I deserve to have X, Y, and Z, and, I'm here, will you be accommodating me, yes or no, and if not, I will be talking to, my attorney. Don't come in like that. Come up and say, hi, I am Orthodox, and I want to do my part because I know that I can't show up, on Shabbos. I know that I can't show up on holidays. What is it that you need me to do in order to help the whole process go smoothly so I can get accommodated for my religious practices? And they'll tell you what to do. And then let's say they tell you, and which they commonly tell you is, give us a list of all the days that you're, available. That you're not available, sorry, because of the holidays. Here's a huge thing I have to tell everybody, and this is really important, okay? If you take away nothing I said today, please remember this. When you submit a list of the holidays and that you're not available to work, do not include any holidays unless you absolutely cannot work. I understand it's hard to work when you're fasting, but you're allowed to work when you're fasting. I know that you don't want to work on Purim, but you're allowed to work on Purim. Not only should you not include those days on your list, which I have seen people include, don't do what a lot of people do, which is they put the basic, I can't work on Shabbos, I can't work on, this holiday, that holiday, the other holiday, all the dates. And then on the bottom, they say, well, these are dates that I can potentially work. However, it's difficult to work because I'm fasting. It would be nice if I could have off. No. Now you're starting to move into the entitled, right? Why should you not inconvenience yourself and everybody else gets inconvenienced, right? So actually, you come in, you give the bare minimum what you have to take off. You do everything you can to say that you want to help the situation so it goes smoothly and you're available in any way you can accommodate. And then you wait and see what they come back with. Now, one other thing I want to say, because I know I've been asked to say this, to talk about this, and that is documenting, okay? It is very important that you document the fact that you ask for reasonable accommodations and what they've said. Again, documentation needs to be done very, very nicely. Do not show up to your supervisor's office with a phone saying, I am hitting record, and everything you say is going to be recorded and memorialized, and, or coming with a big fat, computer and start typing away every word, he or she says. No, come in, have the conversation, let your supervisor tell you what it is you need to do, and then the documentation begins. You go home, you send an email to your supervisor, you say, thank you so much for meeting me today. Just want to recap to make sure that I got everything right. What you want me to do is X, Y, and Z, and then recap the conversation, document it. I'm being given the wrap up cue, so unfortunately I haven't gotten through a lot of what I would have liked to, but I guess what I want to say is the takeaway from all of this is be nice about everything. There's always a chance later for you to litigate or become nasty, but once you kind of become aggressive, there is no way to pull it back, and that usually is the beginning of the end of whatever's going to happen that's not good in your hospital. So if nothing else, please take that away with you, and it was a pleasure giving you this, and if anybody has any questions about anything I've said, I will be here, we'll have a panel, and I'll be happy to answer.